Hello folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So I've been asked to do a brief review of the Peter Regenyei feathers. I should state, firstly I've been using Peter Regenyei feather for about 3 years now, quite a long time. This has seen quite a lot of use in weekly classes and semi-regular sparring. I don't spar longsword as much as I used to, but it's seen quite a lot of use. And perhaps more importantly, or more relevant than that, a lot of Regenyei feathers, Peter Regenyei, his products, have seen a lot of regular use in my club, both longswords and sabres. And the first thing to say is they're really good quality, very durable. Statistically, they're perhaps not the most durable feathers out there. I suspect that the Ensifer feathers probably have a slightly longer lasting records to them. However, I should mention that the Regenyei feathers are, in general, slightly lighter built. They're not quite as chunky, and they're generally a little bit lighter than the Ensifer versions. I prefer that personally. I know some people prefer the bigger, heavier feathers. There's advantages and disadvantages to using a heavier or a lighter feather. I mean, the obvious advantage to using a lighter feather is that, generally speaking, they don't hit quite as hard. So I think you're more likely to get more hand injuries or have to wear much tougher gloves with the Ensifer feathers. But that's a matter of opinion. I'm not making any strong statements on that front. Coming back to the actual Regenyei feather, so very simply, it's a fairly simple design with a flat section blade. There's really no beveling. There's nothing like an edge on there. Obviously, it's a blunt training sword. So it's a flat slab with a fairly sort of curved line schilt, it's called, or ricassoed section to the blade. That is there, for those of you who don't know, that's there essentially to provide extra protection to your hand, so when blades slide down here, they're less likely to hit your thumb or top of your finger. Also, of course, they are historical. That's how they were done on German or Germanic style practice longswords in the 15th and 16th centuries, and in fact right the way through to the 17th century in Belgium. But also, importantly, and this sometimes gets overlooked, that's there essentially to provide weight in the blade. So obviously what you've got with a feather is a blade which is much narrower, more slender than a real longsword blade, in order to make it slightly safer for practice. And the point of balance tends to be a bit closer to the hand than with a real sword. But to give the weight in front of the hand, to give you the feeling of weight in the blade and make it feel like a sword and react and move like a sword, that weight there is quite important. And as I've mentioned in previous videos, we achieve that with certain types of other practice sword, and we used to do that with the so-called Obershinai, for those of you who remember them, with a lead weight in front of the hand to make a shinai a bit more sword-like than the light basic shinai that you buy from the shop. So Peter Regenyei, flat blade, fairly simple. It's got an even distal taper such that it flexes pretty much in the last third of the blade. Okay, most people like that. I do know some people who prefer a blade that flexes more in the centre of the blade, and it must be said, certainly this generation of Peter Regenyei blade do not really flex in the centre of the blade. I personally prefer that because in blade-on-blade contact it gives a more realistic bind, that is, when the two blades are touching, engaging, pushing against each other, it feels more like a stiff, real blade. And really you shouldn't be in contact with the opponent's blade up here, so it doesn't matter that the end of the blade is flexible. Where you're encountering the other person's blade is pretty much from about there downwards, okay, so the bottom 2/3 of blade, and that part's completely stiff, okay. I can flex it if I try really hard, okay. Oh, my head, there we go. It does flex, obviously, it is a piece of tempered steel, but it's very stiff, and really the flex is in this last part. Now, a disadvantage to that being the case, bearing in mind I prefer that because it makes it more like a real sword when you're practicing, but the disadvantage to having all of the flex in the last third is it puts a lot of stress on this last third of blade, which can sometimes result in breakages up here. and perhaps puts more stress on, and perhaps statistically makes it slightly more likely that the blade will break up here. Having said that, I have never seen one of these Regenyei blades break in a thrust yet. I know it has happened, but I have never seen it. And bearing in mind, I run tournaments and a regular weekly class, and I go to events and everything else. Okay. The other disadvantage to having the flex only in the last part of the blade is, debatably, it hits a little bit harder with the thrust. I have to say I've never really witnessed a big problem with the thrusting force on these feathers in particular. In fact, the Ensifer ones are much stiffer, in my experience anyway. They're much stiffer and hit much harder. So these Regenyei ones are pretty much fine, I think, and I like them. The hilts are pretty basic. He's got a basic cross guard. Obviously you can get custom ones if you want, but he's got a basic cross guard and a couple of different types of pommel. I think the basic pommel is spherical, which I actually really like. I initially bought this scent stopper pommel there, which is hand forged. Not by Peter, I hasten to add actually. He actually gets another blacksmith to forge the cross and the pommel, and he mounts them on his blade. And in hindsight, I wish I'd got the ball pommel actually, which was ironically cheaper. Simply, I prefer them aesthetically now. My tastes have changed a bit, and I have to say the proportions for Fiore in particular, the style that I practice longsword, the hilts on Peter's swords tend to be a bit long, but as I mentioned, all of Peter's swords are handmade, so if you want a shorter hilt or a shorter blade, then you can in fact, just ask him to make a shorter hilt or a shorter blade, or indeed a longer one. You could get a great size version of one of these, and I know some people have a sort of montante size. And I should mention that a couple of people in my club have actually got what we refer to as Fiore feathers made by Peter, which is essentially a slightly scaled down version of this normal sort of German Lichtenau proportioned feather, and it has a shorter hilt, more typical sort of hand and a half sword proportions, and a very slightly shorter blade. We prefer kind of a 35-36 inch blade in general, so a bit shorter than most of the people practicing longsword. And we prefer a hilt that when you're using the sword one-handed, when you're grabbing someone and doing all of this kind of stuff, that it's not going to get in the way, and generally that means probably an inch or two shorter than the average. Okay. So durability good. As I said, I do know that a couple of Regenyeis have broken, but I've not witnessed it personally. One issue I have witnessed personally is the rolled tips, which are a major feature and to me a major plus point of Regenyei's swords. So he rolls over when he's forging it before it's been heat treated. He rolls over this tip and then the blade gets heat treated. The advantage of the rolled tip is it means you've got a blunter tip, obviously, but because it's hollow, it doesn't add weight at the tip, which can result in a blade feeling, first of all, hitting with a bit more force at the tip, but also feeling floppier because it's got a mass at the end of the blade. So if you have a solid swollen tip, like some, I believe the Ensifers do, it adds weight at the tip, which I don't really like. I prefer a hollow rolled tip. Okay, but a disadvantage of the rolled tip, and I've seen this happen once, is someone pulling a sword in my club out of their bag. That rolled tip just caught on the end of another piece of equipment in the bag, and it actually snapped the rolled section off. Because obviously, when you forge roll something, you're work hardening it to an extent. And you have to then anneal it before it gets heat treated, and perhaps in the case of this particular example it hadn't been annealed properly, it got heat treated and the tip ended up being harder and more brittle than it should have been, and it snapped off. What that person did is they went on a grinder and they ground the tip so it was just a flat tip but rounded, and then they've mounted a safe tip on the end of it. So it's still a usable sword. They haven't really lost any length to the blade, they've only lost a centimetre at most, and it's still a usable blade, but that is just something to mention in terms of a review. The grip wrap comes as standard cord. I personally think it's fine. It's cheap, it's nothing special, but it does the job. I know some people, if they're using certain types of glove, if you use gauntlets for example, can abrade that surface and break the string eventually, and you have to rewrap it. But to be honest, a lot of training swords if you're using them on a weekly basis and doing lots of sparring with certain types of gloves. It's gonna happen with basically any sword. So those are the kind of selling points of the Peter Regenyei sword. They're pretty cheap. They come in, I think, about 180 euros for a basic feder. So they're cheap. Peter's good to deal with. He's pretty reliable. And the product is good, it lasts, it does the job, it performs well as a feder. The disadvantage, to my point of view, is the waiting time, and unfortunately when you're dealing with any you know, handmade product, clearly, especially if it's a popular product that's like Peter Regenyei's swords are now, there's going to be a waiting time involved, and initially there was only a waiting time of a couple of months, and I think that's gone up to about 6 months now, which, to be honest, for a basic training weapon, rather than something like a, you know, custom-made sharp sword, for a basic training weapon that you want students in your class to be able to go and buy and equip themselves, hopefully after a couple of months' practice, it's a bit annoying, and it's also a bit annoying when it's such a cheap product, actually. So I would say that's the drawback at the moment. Peter, you need to get more staff and get producing these quicker, okay? Because they're a good product. But it's really annoying for clubs who've got lots of students and lots of new students coming in and moving through the club that you can't get hold of these quicker. That's the frustrating thing with these. And to that end, you know, companies like the HEMA shop, also known as the Night shop, are now mass producing feders, and I'll talk about those in a separate video at some point. But you know, they've got a real strong advantage when you can just buy them off the shelf for the same price or perhaps even cheaper. Okay. The last thing I mentioned, just to reiterate that these feders from Peter Regenyei have changed a little bit since I bought this. They are now a little bit thicker and a little bit stiffer, which I think is a good thing. I think it makes them less likely to break, and obviously a broken blade is a dangerous blade. But also they haven't really changed much. The basic characteristics of them are still the same, and they are really good. They're used all over the world. They're used in tournaments in America and in Europe. And also, just lastly, to remind you that they are handmade products, so any detail that you want different, if you want a different shaped shield or a different length blade or a different type of crossguard or whatever, then you can get it, because each one is custom made. Okay, so there we go. Cheers.